Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us, and welcome to our last online seminar of the year for the British Institute for Libyan and Northern African Studies. So we are very, very pleased today to have Dr. Danielle McLean joining us. Danielle is a postdoctoral researcher in the Oxford Tephra Chronology Research Group at the School of Archaeology at the University of Oxford. In 2021, she received a Leverhulme Early Career Fellowship to assess the opportunities of using widespread volcanic ash layers to link archaeological and climate records in Northwest Africa. This fellowship ran in conjunction with the Leverhulme-funded Caves Africa project, which examines the potential impact of climate change on early modern humans over the last 300,000 years. Billness was very pleased to be able to support some of this work. We were able to fund some of the field work and publication opportunities for Danielle and some of the other members of the Caves group as well. So we are really pleased to have Danielle to talk to us today and tell us about this wonderful research. And she is going to tell us in particular about volcanic ash layers, or tephra, to link archaeological and climate records in Northwest Africa. And just before I hand over, just a quick reminder to the audience, if you have any questions for our speaker, please pop them into the Q&A box that you will find at the bottom of the screen, and I will read them out at the end of the talk. So without further ado, over to you, Danielle.
Thank you, Nicole. And yeah, thank you everyone for joining and to Vilnas for the opportunity to speak about the project today. Really looking forward to giving this talk. So yes, I'm based at the School of Archaeology in the University of Oxford as part of the Tephra Chronology Research Group. And in this presentation, I wanted to give a little bit of background to the Caves Africa project, which, as mentioned, was a Leverhulme funded project. And I'm also going to specifically go into details about how we've been able to use volcanic ash or tephra layers to help us date and synchronize both the archaeological sites and climate records in Northwest Africa. So this project kind of brings together many different disciplines to kind of think about some of these long-standing questions surrounding kind of the evolution of Homo sapiens and how we developed, moved, and kind of survived against, a changing climate world in Northwest Africa. So this work is really highly collaborative and involved lots of different people from lots of different institutes. So I'll kind of touch on these contributions as we go through. But just to say that, this is bringing together kind of experts in archaeology, paleoclimate reconstruction, archaeology and volcanology from around the world. So it's been really amazing for us to work kind of together on this. And in terms of the Oxford Tephra group, we have myself, we have Professor Victoria Smith, who's at the top there. We have PhD student Elo Wilkinson-Rowe and also postdoc Emma Horn, who have contributed considerably to some of the work that I'll go into and show today. So the Caves Africa project is also led by Professor Nick Barton as PI, with co-PIs as Victoria Smith, Amy Starion and Kevin Uno as well. So yeah, I also just wanted to flag that Bill Nass has also provided really significant support for making this project possible as well. As I'll mention later on, they provided funding for us to do some of the initial field work and get some radiometric dates for some of the eruptions we've looked at. And they've also helped me kind of pull some of this work together for publication. So if you're interested in any of the things I'm talking about today, we've got a really nice summary paper out in Libyan Studies, which kind of talks quite generally about the opportunities of using volcanic ash to synchronize the records and has a lot of the key kind of source literature that I'm kind of pulling upon today. So first I'm going to give a little bit of background to the project and some rationale for how the Caves project kind of really came about. So until recently, Northwest Africa was kind of considered to have quite a peripheral role in the debates about early human origins. So much of the attention was kind of focused on areas in the South and East Africa, and it was kind of assumed that areas in the Maghreb, lay quite far away from these centres, and that Homo sapiens really dispersed there much, much later on. And so we were actually seeing in the archaeological record kind of a delayed appearance of humans and ideas and cultural influences from the East. So it was kind of considered quite peripheral and marginal to the story of our evolution. However, like things do, a kind of a more nuanced picture has kind of emerged through time and with more finds and better dating. So we've started to see that Northwest Africa has actually become one of the real core areas of human evolutionary developments. And so this paper by Scarry and others, they propose that Homo sapiens may have actually evolved in kind of several different centres across the continent and at different times. And, this is actually really supported by the discovery of these different human skulls across the continent, which are kind of shown in this figure here. And you can see that there's a huge variation of dates and also features in the skulls that kind of suggest that our species was kind of born from this occasional mixing of these isolated populations. And you can see from the ages on here that kind of Northwest Africa was really flagged as one of these really important regions, with sites like Jebel Hood in Morocco being really kind of shaping this discussion and suggesting that early humans were in Northwest Africa much earlier than we thought, so maybe it's older than 300,000 years ago. So to kind of understand the movement and the development of the people at this time, we really have to think about the environments in which they lived. So of course, Northwest Africa is a very dynamic environment, and that has changed dramatically through time in terms of its climate. So we see a significant interplay between the systems in the North Atlantic, as well as air masses from the Mediterranean kind of coming together. And we also see kind of overlaid upon this changes with the monsoon, which are changing the direction of the prevailing winds, and also kind of changes in rainfall over time. So yeah, we essentially through time have seen really remarkable changes in the climate in this region, which has basically transformed the Sahara. So during quite humid intervals, and these are typically known as green Sahara periods, we would see the areas that today we consider quite hyper-arid become in more like grasslands, wetlands with lake systems. And it's actually suggested that there's I think, more than 230 humid intervals across the Miocene, which are kind of shown on this figure here with all of these green dashes. But it's not really clear. Well, of course, these green periods would have allowed people to move a lot more freely across the landscapes, but it's not really clear when and which green periods that people may have moved, and how frequently. So we do have a good understanding on some of these humid periods. So for example, in the Holocene, we have the African humid period when the climate and the Sahara was much wetter than today. So that was from about 11 to 5,000 years ago. And also in marine isotope stage 5e during the Eocene, we see that the Sahara was kind of transformed into these kind of grassy areas with these really large megalakes, which are being shown here on this map, which was plotted by Nick Drake and colleagues. So it was likely that migration happened across the Green Sahara periods, where you have these interconnected basins and river channels, which kind of prevented, where the deserts aren't actually preventing movement. And the distribution of the fossil remains kind of stack with this kind of evidence. So here you can see some of their Middle Stone Age finds that you can see are falling upon some of these old river channels which are flowing from off the Sahara. So suggesting that these may have been contemporary finds with the rivers and may have been some of the routes that were chosen. So as well as archaeological evidence, we have, as well as environmental records, we have archaeological evidence for this as well. So we've got in the early Holocene some of these depictions in cave art. So we can see animals like giraffes that are no longer present in these regions, where it's telling us that the landscape once supported these kind of ecosystems. Okay, so yeah, one of these humid periods, so in MIS 9 that I talked about, we do actually see some early human remains at Jebel Irhoud. So this is one of the oldest and richest MIS sites, and this is dated to older than 300,000 years ago. And at this site, the skull that's been found has a really curious morphology. As you may know, it has a really big brain, but with quite a primitive skull shape, and has been found along with this assemblage, which is typically MSA in its characteristics. As well, in Morocco, we see a really early onset of some really remarkable symbolic behaviors. So we see these shell beads, which are Tritium marine shell beads, which have these deliberate perforations in them and evidence of kind of wear around these holes, which suggests that may have been used on necklaces and kind of strung up. And we also see this kind of red staining, suggesting they may have been coloured and burnt as well. So some of these sites are really old, older than 100,000 years ago, and probably older than other places that we know, like in the Near East and in Southern Africa as well. Kind of again hinting that this is really a key region if we want to learn more about the onset of some of these early behaviours and technologies. Yeah, so to kind of sum this up a little bit, sites in Morocco really do have a very rich archaeological record. So moving from Middle Stone Age assemblage up to much later LSA assemblage, and you see this movement from kind of classic Assyrian technology, like Livawa techniques, moving into this composite core kind of tanged points kind of technology. And at sites like Tephra, which I'll come back to, you also kind of see this kind of transitional technology as well. It's not quite MSA, not quite LSA, kind of suggesting maybe some of these developments were not as abrupt as you see in other sites. So for a little bit more background to this, I would recommend reading Nick Barton and colleagues' more recent paper from last year, which kind of sums up kind of the current perspective on the MSA to LSA history of Morocco. There's a lot more detail in there. Okay, so essentially we kind of have these overarching questions that have kind of been around for a long time, really. And that is, we're still not particularly clear when early humans kind of moved into these different areas, when some of these cultural innovations occurred, when these population spikes occurred and when they contracted, and how humans really responded to the really dramatic climatic conditions that were changing over this time period. So did some of these innovations come about when times were hard, when you were forced to innovate, or were they when times were good and populations could kind of mix and share technologies? And these questions are really kind of there because of a real difficulty in being able to precisely date the finds that in the archaeological sites with really good precision, and also to kind of pin what we're seeing with these archaeological changes against a good climate record. And some of this is because, for the most part, we're kind of outside the limit of radiocarbon dating, which is around 50,000 years ago. And it can just be very difficult to kind of correlate one site to another because of your uncertainties on your dates. So sometimes your radiocarbon error or your luminescence error might be quite large, and so it may be, difficult with that error to actually even place yourself in a particular period in the climate sequence. So this is what kind of brought about the Caves project back in 2022. So the idea of the project is kind of to build new paleoclimate records, so for the cave sites themselves, and also to use new paleoclimate records using marine cores from the North Atlantic. So the bonus with using the marine cores from the North Atlantic is that we have this really continuous record of sedimentation, which contains a whole host of proxies that can be used to reconstruct vegetation, fire, and temperature. And we can also create a nice age model with this sedimentation, meaning that we can really pin down the chronology of the climate at that time. And other colleagues like Stacey Carolyn and Amy Styring have been looking at isotopes of small mammals in the cave and kind of building up a proxy record from the cave sites as well. We've also been aiming to use the volcanic ash layers to kind of use these to provide more chronological control and to kind of link these records together. So how can volcanic ash help us in this way? So during a quite considerable eruption, so at least a subplanetary or planetary eruption, and with eruptions that produce a large volume of ash, the ash, or also known as tephra, can be dispersed really vast distances. So in some cases, ash can be dispersed thousands of kilometers across continental scales. And when the ash is deposited, they can form these really beautiful markers in a whole range of sedimentary sequences. So these can include ice cores, like in the Greenland ice core, we have many, many tephra layers. In lake cores, in marine cores, and in the archaeological sites themselves. And the beauty of these means that because this deposition is essentially geologically instantaneous, we can use these markers to actually link distal records together really precisely without any chronological imprecision at all. Now, some layers of tephra can be nice thick layers like we see in this, this lake core here from Japan. So this is a few centimeters thick, and you can clearly see the deposition in the core. It's got quite a nice sharp boundary, and you can see that it's really nice fine grained ash sandwiched between the host sediment of the lake. But sometimes we can also look for the presence of cryptotephra layers within the sequence as well. So these are volcanic ash layers that are preserved still within the sediments, but they contain much lower concentrations of ash particles, so we can't really confidently see them within the sedimentation. But they still, are perfectly preserved as a layer, in the most part, in the sediments themselves. So to kind of find and locate their stratigraphic position, you can use a range of different techniques. And typically we would essentially use an extraction procedure in the lab to actually float out the ash from the sediment itself. and I'll touch on this in a moment. Um, and yeah, in some ways, cryptotephra layers can be even more valuable than these kind of visible layers, even though it's a lot more time consuming to find them. So cryptotephra layers might come from lower magnitude eruptions that we might, not know much about, especially if their deposits are now kind of destroyed around the volcano themselves. And for us, the bonus is that the cryptotephra layers may come from more distal eruptions, so eruptions much further away, and allow us to link records over a much broader geographical footprint. So linking lots of archaeological sites and marine cores together using just one ash. So the tephra itself, especially when you're quite far away from source, you're not really getting any crystals that are being dispersed, but you're just getting the glass shards, which are very silicic and have quenched during the eruption themselves. So they have quite a distinctive morphology. Sometimes you'll see these kind of gas bubbles in them as the gases were kind of trapped as it was trying to escape when the glass was quenched during the eruption. And they can have these kind of fluting morphologies as well when the ash is kind of moving through the glass as it's quenched. So yeah, this morphology is really helpful for us to kind of actually identify the ash with against other things that may be in the core, like diatoms and other organic material that has very different morphology. Okay, so the idea really is then to use these widespread ash layers to kind of link the marine cores and other climate records and use these to precisely correlate across and link to our really beautiful archaeological record. And then when we have these linkages, we can then examine what's going on in the climate proxies around this time. So how do we know which eruption is which? How do we know that we have the same eruption in our marine core and then in our archaeological site? And we can do this by looking at the chemistry of the volcanic glass itself. So different volcanoes have a different kind of chemistry preserved in the glass. And so what we would typically do is visit quite close to the volcano, what we'd call proximal eruption sequence, where we can see the sequence of the deposits quite clearly of the pumice and ash falls. So here's an example here of unit 1, 2, and 3 moving up through time. And we'll go and sample these eruption deposits and analyse the chemistry of the glass. And we will do the same when we find the ash in the lake core. So you can see here in this schematic that the major and trace elements in the proximal zone and in our lake core or archaeological site should match perfectly. So in this schematic you can see the circles and the crosses overlap, and so we would then secure that as a confident match. So we look, as I mentioned, at the majors and the trace element ratios and compositions of the ash. And so we can do that in-house in Oxford using the electron microprobe, looking at the major elements. And you can also use laser ablation ICP-MS to pick up the trace elements, which are much, much lower in concentration. So here you can see that we've got a glass shard that's about to be analysed on the screen. So these are really, really, really tiny. So in this case, it's about 20 microns wide. And we can just about fit the beam on here to analyse it. Yeah. So in Northwest Africa, what are kind of our main possible volcanic regions that could be producing large eruptions and dispersing ash across this region? So in the North Atlantic, we have the Azores, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verdes. And here I've just plotted on rose diagrams showing current wind, prevailing wind directions since 1990. And you can see that the Azores and the Canary Islands are really the main key candidates for us with the prevailing winds kind of heading towards Northwest Africa. So Cape Verdes is kind of not really a key candidate for us, although it would have been lovely to go there, so I wish it was. So when we were thinking about this, we tried to do some very, very basic ash dispersal modeling using some of the parameters we know from some of these volcanoes in these regions. So here I'm just showing scenario one, which is an eruption that hypothetically would occur from Setsadas in the Azores. And the parameters that I've used, it's quite a small volume, kind of a VEI4 eruption, so quite moderate, but quite typical of what we would expect from the Azores. And this is kind of a simulation in the winter, so January 22, November 22, where you can see, we can quite easily see and model ash fall and cryptotephra concentrations that would be deposited across Europe and also Northwest Africa. And we played around with some of these. So this second scenario is a slightly larger eruption, VEI5, and then 2B was a simulation kind of running that for 72 hours to really see where's the maximum that we could be looking to kind of link records together. So this was very interesting for us to kind of see how quickly the winds can really change and like kind of affect what we would actually get across Northwest Africa. And it's like you would expect especially across the Azores, where you have really changeable prevailing winds and kind of influences on that. Each day you could simulate something almost completely different, which was interesting to think about when we're looking for very specific eruptions that we think it's large enough, why is it not there? And that really is a function of the particular day. So this kind of modelling stacks up with what we're actually seeing in the geological record. So there's been a whole host of different studies that have come out recently and across Europe, and I've kind of plotted these with a blue box here. And these are sites that report cryptotephra layers within lakes and peat bogs and so on that have compositions of ash that look like they're coming from the Azores. Now, most of these studies are quite young, so in the last 5,000 years-ish, because that has been the focus of cryptotephra studies, especially in Europe. But it is, yeah, very promising for us that this kind of also holds true, that Azores is a really good candidate for some of these widespread ashes. So I should mention actually that in a lot of these papers, the correlation to the Azores and even the volcano or the specific eruption is quite uncertain. So we're not really sure where these are actually coming from, which events. And that is because we don't really have these detailed geochemical data sets that we need from each volcano to actually match them in the distal zone. So reconstructing the volcanic histories and the magmatic histories of these island settings is really, really difficult, and especially for eruptions when you're looking older than 50,000 years ago. So here's a picture of Setsadas caldera, which is on San Miguel Island in the Azores. And you can see here that the island is really, really heavily vegetated. It has very steep relief, and it's located really, really close to the coast. So you can see the coast in the distance there. It's like less than 5 kilometers away. So when these eruptions occur, most of the deposits are deposited offshore, or there's eroded quite quickly over time with the significant rainfall. And so sometimes these eruptions just aren't really well preserved on islands, so we don't really have a good long sequence that we can look at and go, okay, there were this many eruptions over this period of time. It's quite patchy. Yeah, as I mentioned, the glass compositional data sets to compare to were quite limited in terms of what we would need, because we are really interested in matching and kind of understanding how unique different eruptions through time are, so that we don't mistakenly correlate the wrong layers. So when we started, we kind of pulled together everything that we could. in terms of the compositional data from the Cape Verdes, the Canary Islands, and the Azores. And just looking at the silica and the alkali content of the tephra that's erupted from these islands, you can see here with the different colours, it's quite easy to separate the different archipelagos. So that was really promising that we can quite confidently say which island setting the tephra is coming from. But then when we have a look at kind of the glass data that exists for, say, San Miguel Island, which is then in blue on the right-hand side, you can see there's quite a lot of overlap for even the different volcanoes on that one island. So we had a lot of work to do before we could even start using these layers as markers. So for us, we were really looking at three key kind of workflows to pull this together. So as I mentioned, visiting the islands and characterizing the eruptions themselves, then moving to the marine cores and the archaeological sites to find the layers that we're interested in. So our first field campaign was on San Miguel Island, as I just mentioned, and Billness support really helped us kind of build the collaborations with researchers on the islands who came out with us and helped us find some of the key deposits on the islands themselves. We could not have done this without them because a lot of these sites had been looked at by students over many, many years and not been published. And yeah, their knowledge on these deposits was really instrumental in actually getting enough samples from these different deposits. So here I'm just showing you some of the sites with the pins of where we went to. And you can see most of the sites are on the coast where you kind of get these nice outcrops of multiple eruptions. And I've also shown you here the three key volcanic centres on San Miguel Island, so Setsudas, Fogo and Furnas. And these are kind of the three most active and explosive centres on this one island. So we were trying to pick up as many deposits as we could and characterise each volcano and their eruptions. So we are basically using as many published geographies as we can and kind of putting these things in order together. And here's a little time lapse of myself and Victoria Smith sampling some of these deposits. So we're essentially just collecting some of the pumice and ash so that we get a really good representative sample of each eruptive unit to be sure that we are really getting the full compositional range of the eruption. So as well as taking these samples, we were also on the lookout for some organic material that we could date ourselves using radiocarbon dating and to date with argon-argon dating with the K-feldspar crystals. So here was a beautiful stump that we found that was charred in one of the deposits that we were able to take a slice of and bring back and use the tree rings and tree ring wiggle matching to date this particular eruption at the source. So we ended up with a really beautiful data set for the Azores and the explosive centres on the Azores over the last 300,000 years. And this is brought together in Emma Horn's paper in JVGR. And here's just a data plot kind of summarizing that. And just to say that you can see there's quite a lot of overlap with the major element composition. So if you just looked at the silica and the aluminium, you can see there's quite a lot of overlap with the range of these. But we found that looking at the trace elements, they were really instrumental of kind of pulling different eruptions apart and different volcanoes apart. And Emma produced this really awesome flow diagram. So if you found some ash from the Azores, you could kind of use these different steps and look at these different ranges that are typical for each volcano and eruption. And you can kind of follow this down to work out which tephra you have, and hopefully that matches up with the age of that event as well. So if you're interested, here's a QR code for Emma's paper that has all of the data sets and a bit more information in it. And she's also now working on the bigger data set, which includes data from all of the 9 Azores Islands, which she's putting together at the moment. So I won't spend too long on this, but just to mention that we've also done a similar fieldwork campaign in Tenerife. And so we've been using, again, the published stratigraphies, the known eruptive sequence through time to characterize these known members. So here I'm just showing you some of the sites again on Tenerife, mainly on the south and in the Caldera Wall that we visited. And you can see here in this colourful stratigraphy diagram, this is kind of the really well-established stratigraphy of eruptive activity from Las Canadas in Tenerife. And you can see there's a whole bunch of argon-argon ages that already exist for these eruptions, which is great if we find, for us, if we find these layers in the marine cores and in the archaeological sites themselves. The Elo, the PhD student, has also done an immense amount of work on these samples, putting together fingerprints for the different formations. Quite a similar story to the Azores, where the major elements are quite overlapping. So you can see here is a bit of a headache to try and work out what's distinctive about each eruption. But again, the trace elements here shown in a couple of these biplots really help to show how these can be split more confidently, which you can see with the different symbols and colours. And as well as some important implications for us and using Tephra to correlate, there's some really interesting shifts that you can pick out from the chemistry of the Tephra deposits themselves for the magmatic kind of evolution of Tenerife through time. So you can see there are these really marked shifts after some of the larger caldera forming events, where it suggests that the magmatic system has kind of significantly changed, and you can kind of see this build up to some of the really large caldera forming events, like the Abrigo event on the top here. So to kind of sum up this, we now have this really useful database. We had a lot of difficulty with the radiocarbon dates because because it's so humid, a lot of the organics had weathered away and eroded. But we've got some really nice argon-argon dates, which kind of makes sense with what we're seeing with the radiocarbon dates, that the eruptions may be slightly older because of this contamination with younger organics. Some other findings were that we really needed some tarts to keep going from the Azores to keep going in the fieldwork. And even though our luggage didn't turn up, we were able to keep going with a knife from the Airbnb, collecting some samples. Okay, so moving on now to Tephra in marine cores. So we've been using 3 key marine cores in the North Atlantic. So 2 GOB cores collected during German cruise, so 5559 and 4216. So these are just northeast of the Canary Islands, and also ODP 958B. So with these, we're hoping to really capture the dispersal from both the Azores and the Canary Islands around this region and towards Africa. So we started this just after the COVID pandemic. So we went out to Marham to sample some of the marine cores that are held in the repository there. And here we're just showing you a time lapse of the continuous sampling through the core to find these layers. So if you're interested in learning more about how we actually locate the Tephra layers, I have a YouTube video that kind of goes into a bit more detail, which I could share with you. But essentially, we're taking contiguous samples through the core, and we dry these, weigh these, and add some HCl to remove carbonates. We sieve them to remove any fine material, and then we use a density extraction where we use this heavy liquid to float off the glass from everything else that's in the sample. And essentially then we should, on our microscope slides, then have the glass shards on that slide to count. So what did we find? So in Marine Corps 4016, here I'm showing you the stratigraphy on the left, and you can see that I'm showing the concentration of glass shards through the core. So this is 0, so present day, down to around 260,000 years ago. And we can see these clear peaks in glass shard concentrations. So a couple of these layers are visible. And we were quite surprised by how low the background was between these events, because we thought that being a marine setting, we might see a little bit of disturbance, but we don't really see that. And we have some really nice correlations. So I've plotted here this lower tephra, which is the squares, and this sort of one at 170,000 years with the circles. And you can see here, just in these plots, if we specifically look at the trace elements, we can be really confident that we have the eruption, the Abrigo eruption from Tenerife, which is dated to 170,000 years ago, and the porous eruption that's dated to around 260. As well as eruptions from Tenerife, we can see quite clearly that we also are picking up something from the Azores. So I've just kind of plotted the kind of overall fields behind it here. And we were really pleased to pick up this eruption that's known as the Lajes Angra eruption, which was thought to be erupted around 25,000 years ago, which kind of matches the age that we have from the Marine Corps. Yeah, we're able to use one of our new argon dates, which we got for the Lajes Angra eruption from the Azores, to kind of import this into our age model. So we've got an age of 26.9 plus or minus 0.8. So what do we see further south in 958b? So here again, I've put it on its side, but you are seeing now the glass shard concentrations through time. So you see many, many more peaks. So the upper part starts around 50,000 years ago, and about 8 meters depth. We're at about 350,000 years ago. And you can see these peaks, which I've then labeled and put the approximate age for these on the top here. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about each layer, but just to say that we're also picking up eruptions in different compositional groups, suggesting different sources for these eruptions from the Azores and from Tenerife as well. And this kind of summarizes what we have. So we have many of the eruptions from Tenerife, specifically in the lower parts. And we're able to import the argon ages for some of these to tighten up our age model. And we were really particularly pleased that we were able to constrain this lowermost layer named 693, because we weren't sure at the time whether this was the Fasnia or the Aldea, but we were able to confidently correlate this now to the Aldea event and import that age to the lower part of the core. So just to say what work's ongoing on these cores, and colleagues in Harvard, so Bryce and Kevin, are working on building up the proxy record for this so that we can now use the improved chronology to kind of look at the climate changes through time. So I'm going to skip over this really, but just to say that we've now found some of the first kind of distal occurrences of these eruptions, and actually kind of pick up which eruptions are going which ways, and candidates to actually look for these layers in the archaeological sites. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the archaeological sites themselves and the really detailed work that we've been doing at these sites to kind of find these layers in more distal settings. So as part of the CASE project, we've been looking at a number of sites. So these include Bismoon, Dar Sultan, and Tephra. And I am just going to focus on Tephra here and talk a little bit more detail about that. So many of you may be familiar with Tephra. It's a cave that you can see here, the cave mouth, and there's also a car down there for scale, so it's got quite a big mouth entrance, which is really good when we're thinking about ash kind of coming into the cave and then being preserved within the sequence. So here is a map of the cave itself. So on the right hand side you can see the wall, so looking into the cave. And there are lots of different sectors that have been excavated, and this has been excavated for many, many years. And you can see these different trenches that have all, different time periods and assemblages associated with them. And in the picture on the left, you'll see Sector 9, which is where we've been undertaking this new work. So here's a video just for you to get a little bit more context about the site. So this again is that front wall, and on the right here you can see Sector 9 where we were excavating a few years ago, and the cave where all the pigeons hide out. And towards the back of the cave there are some really interesting burial sites that Louise Humphrey and colleagues have been working for a long time. So in Sector 9, we've got this beautiful record that's been developed looking at the pollen and the microcharcoal and the microfossils, and you can see this change through time, particularly in the upper part of mixed oak to cedar to mixed oak again during the glacial period. And this kind of coincides where you see this very interesting intermediate technology. So how do we look for tephra in the cave itself? Well, it's a little bit harder than using a continuous marine core because your sections might not be completely continuous and you might not be able to get a full column going through. So what we typically do is use these separate overlapping columns, and so we can kind of build this kind of picture through the different contexts. So in 2015, a lot of work was done on the very upper parts of Tephra, and they found that there were quite a lot of ash found through the sequence. And just to highlight here that the compositions looked very similar to the Azores, but a correlation wasn't really secured at that time. And we have gone through these sequences and found a huge number of other peaks through the core, particularly in Sector 9. So here I'm showing the concentrations next to the radiocarbon chronology through Sector 9, and also the ash that was found in this upper part that was previously published. And I'm just going to focus on this upper part here, where you can see that there are these peaks in green and brown shards, and multiple peaks. And we have found that these layers correspond to ash coming from the Azores, and we're able to confidently correlate two eruptions, so Santa Barbara eruption from Setsidaz and Ponta Guscia Ingdenbright from Furness, and link these to these eruptions and import the age into the chronology. So work is still going on in these caves, and we're still working on correlations for some of the other peaks, but we have some really good candidates that we're looking out for that have been kind of flagged from the Marine Corps. But this is a really time-intensive process with very low shard numbers, and we're very pleased to have the correlations that we have at the moment. Okay, so to sum up, essentially, we've generated new glass datasets which are really useful for us and for others going forward, looking to identify ash layers in their sites and correlate these to eruptions and use the chronology and linkages with these widespread ash layers. Trace elements are really important to secure correlations. So the Azores and Canary Island eruptions can be found quite extensively in the North Atlantic, and these provide new insights into the eruptive histories of these volcanoes and which ash layers are widely dispersed. And we can now date some of these eruptions using the Marine Corps stratigraphy as well. Some of these eruptions we haven't found on islands, suggesting that they're not very well preserved now on the islands themselves. And looking at in these distal sites in the archaeological setting, we know that Azores tephra is really widely dispersed, over 2,000 kilometers away. Setzidas and Furnas are really good candidates for widespread ash dispersal across this region. So with that, I hope that I've kind of convinced you of the opportunities of using Tephra for linking sites. And I'll just flag some further acknowledgements from students and other colleagues that have been instrumental in kind of bringing this work together. So I'll leave it there. And yeah, so we've got a little bit of time for questions as well. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. Thank you so much, Danielle, for that very comprehensive and very clear explanation of how this all works and the research you've been doing. That's really, really amazing. You've clearly, you and the team have clearly um, yes, done something really, really interesting and very helpful, I think, for many of us. Yes, so as I said, please, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please do pop them into the Q&A box, and I will read them out. Um, but I will start with a question again, because excuse my not knowing very much about this. But so you sort of mentioned that obviously the eruptions obviously can potentially be spreading ash, really quite far across Europe and North Africa. And I was just wondering whether there has been, yeah, or perhaps it's too early, any kind of indication of results and being able to apply this from anywhere further afield yet, or if there's plans to test this in areas further afield.
Yeah, I think yeah, there's definitely opportunity to do that. I think as I mentioned in the talk, a lot of the Cryptotephra studies at the moment have focused on quite young sequences. And in some cases it is very hard to find very long records. But some lakes potentially also picking up some of these Tenerife eruptions. So the candidate that I talked about for the Abrigo eruption at 170,000 years, that's clearly a really widely dispersed event because we're picking up as quite a thick layer within the marine core. So that would be a really, I think that's got a lot of potential to link a lot of records further afield. Yeah, so hopefully we'll see some more
Yes.
identifications of these.
Yes, well, I mean, you can see definitely how this research is potentially, over time is going to have quite a large impact on studies going forward, which will be really great. Um, I wonder if you also might just tell us a little bit where, kind of in particular, where your own research is headed next on this topic and kind of what you're interested in pursuing.
Yeah, so in terms of the project itself, I think we still have a lot to do, kind of pulling everything together. So yeah, we are really thinking about the cave sites and what makes a good cave site for tephra preservation, and how does that vary across one cave site, for example. So we've done a lot of work on tephra out, and it would be very interesting to see how the preservation changes around the cave, like at the front of the cave, side of the cave, like how that's going to work, and if we could use it to kind of link some of these sectors together as well, not just linking to other sites. Um, yeah, and yeah, we also are really excited to have the climate record come together and kind of really interrogate that a little bit further, and kind of use these tephras then to kind of see what we can say about when the tephras are being dispersed. So, for example, it seems like some of the dispersal and widespread dispersal, particularly from the Azores, is more likely in the winter. So
Hmm.
it would be interesting to see how this changes in glacial and interglacial periods. Like, are we seeing more in kind of colder periods when we have certain kinds of interplay of climate, at work? So it would be interesting to kind of interrogate those kinds of questions a bit further.
Yes. Great. That's really wonderful. Okay, so we do have a question from Graham Barker. And so he asks, so are the prime absolute dates for the eruptions coming from terrestrial sediments near the calderas or from the sediments in the marine cores?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So it's a mixture of lots of different dating techniques kind of coming together. So Um, we are able to date some of the eruptions using argon-argon dating from the volcanoes themselves. We can have those, particularly for some of the older eruptions. We can use those argon-argon dates. For some of the younger events, they are dated with radiocarbon dating on the island, but as we've kind of figured out, we think that these ages are just a little bit too young because of modern contamination and the preservation issues that I mentioned. So I think in some cases we should be relying a little bit more on the argon dates rather than the radiocarbon dates, but that's something we could think about because some we have dated with radiocarbon and with argon argon, so we can really interrogate that a little bit. But not every eruption is dated with argon argon because it's very expensive and they don't have enough potassium feldspar in some of them. So actually then some of our best ages are actually going to come from the marine cores because we can essentially create these Bayesian age models and import as many ages as we have, like the argon dates, to constrain the tephras that are dated to then help us date ones that aren't. And this is going to be, this seems to be working really well. So we can kind of check how many constraints we put in. You know, are we still getting the right ages for the ones that we know should be a certain age? So we can kind of pull all of these dating kind of lines of evidence together to kind of come up with the chronology. And of course, Tephra is very well dated as well. It has a lot of radiocarbon dates. And these also seem to be kind of in line with what we're expecting for the eruptions. So I think, yeah, I think we just need to be open to using whatever dates and kind of checking, cross-checking them together.
Fabulous. Okay, well, if there aren't any further questions, before we wrap up, I do just want to say, although this is our last online lecture of the academic year, we will be holding our annual summer event in person this year on May the 29th at the Africa Centre in London. This event is entitled Wisdom of the Hand, Amazigh Textile Tradition in Libya and Tunisia. And this is going to feature a lecture by Anita Redini and will be presented by Najla El Jelly. And it will be followed by a discussion with them and along with Barbara Spadaro on the traditions of Amazigh textile production. So please do sign up for this. You either will have already or will receive an email about this with registration information, or you can find the information on our website, billness.org. If you are not already a member, please do consider joining Billness or making a donation so that we can continue to bring you events like these ones. And so it only remains now for me to thank Danielle for a fantastic talk. Really, thank you so much. And oh, and a comment, Graham says, lovely presentation, Danielle. So thank you everyone for coming. Thank you again to our speaker, Danielle, and I wish everyone a good evening. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.